Transformation and a people called to belong. And today's topic is a people called to love in action. For the past 3 weeks, and now this being the fourth week, you've been looking at passages from the first letter of Peter, one of the letters in the New Testament. And I've listened to the sermons that Pastors Paul and George have preached on these passages from 1 Peter. And I realize, well, some of you may have missed one or both of those Sundays previously. And so I'd like to start by reviewing some key points that set us up for what we want to look at today. The letter is addressed to God's chosen strangers in the world of the diaspora. By the way, the translation I'm reading from is the Common English Bible. This letter is addressed to people who are living in the Roman provinces of what we now know as Turkey. And they were scattered from their homes. So that Peter goes on to say, you are immigrants and strangers, or another translation says you are aliens and exiles. And as is often the case, these immigrants were treated with suspicion and insults. They were taken advantage of. They were abused by some of the people among whom they lived. So that Peter could say of them a little later in this letter about the fiery trials that have come upon you to test you. That's who they were. That's where they were. Peter begins the letter with a reminder to these immigrants and strangers of who they are in God's eyes. So first thing he says in chapter 1, verse 1 is that God has called them. And then goes on to say, you have been born anew into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. You have a pure and enduring inheritance that cannot perish, an inheritance that is presently kept safe in heaven for you. You can see right away that Peter is writing this as a letter of encouragement. And he's saying that their encouragement is founded on their confidence in God and what God has done for them. And Peter reminds them of who they are in God's eyes. He goes on to say, you yourselves are being built into living stones, into a spiritual temple. You are being made into a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And then goes on to say, and Pastor George has talked about this, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people who are God's own possession. Once you weren't a people, but now you are God's people. Once you hadn't received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Now let's just try to imagine those people to whom this letter is addressed, far away from their home and their family and the security of all that's familiar. And they're being treated badly by the people around them, amongst whom they have found themselves. And I think how much it must have lifted their spirits to be reminded that God loves them. To be reminded that they belong to God. To be reminded that God has chosen them to be special. God has given them dignity and status and honor. But of course, the scriptures don't just address people who lived long ago and far away. They're also addressed to us. And that's why in this worship series, you have been reminded of who you are and who we are corporately as followers of Jesus, as the church. God has called you and made of you a people, God's own people. That is the church's identity. Now today, in light of all that I've just said and reminded you of, we move on to a new consideration, and that is, what does this mean for our lives? What does it mean to be God's people? How should we respond to this? And that's what Peter goes on to address in the rest of his letter. Peter lists 6 things for God's people to be and do. And you've heard them read for us a moment ago. 6 instructions for how to live. Finally, he says, all of you be of one mind. Be sympathetic. Be lovers of your fellow believers. Be compassionate and modest in your opinion of yourselves. That's just 5, and we're going to stop at 5 for now. We'll come to the 6th one a little bit later. But I want to consider with you each one of these briefly. The first one, all of you be of one mind. You'll be relieved to know this doesn't mean you have to all agree on every point. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, though, that we have to pull together. In politics and in religion and in many aspects of life, we have many different views. I'm sure you know that. We have different understandings of things. We have different values that we uphold. And it seems like the differences are multiplying and expanding. Social media is often blamed for exacerbating polarization. And it certainly contributes. Those of you who follow various social media platforms know somebody posts something and the comments in response to that can be just absolutely horrible. And the accusations that people make against each other can be devastating. And of course, then people respond in kind. But even if we're not on social media, we know that there are people who say such things behind other people's backs, and sometimes to their faces. But we have also seen that when people face a common challenge, they can come together and be of one mind. It's hard for me to believe that this month we are marking the 5th anniversary of the first COVID deaths and restrictions. But we do remember that during those COVID times, we often heard and probably often said, we're all in this together. And it's a phrase that I've also heard used recently in the threat of economic tariffs. And it's a phrase that I've sometimes heard in the church. When we face challenges that need our combined efforts to address, sometimes we say we're all in this together, and that's a way of saying we are of one mind. Number 2, all of you be sympathetic. That means to be emotionally connected with other people. Paul wrote about this also in his letter to the Romans. He said we should rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. We've been reminded of that in one of the songs that we just sang. I think we probably have all, I hope we all have experienced that with our close friends, the people around us, our family members. When a friend is diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, when one of our children wins an award, when somebody's parent passes away, or when somebody finally gets a long-sought job, we empathize with them, we share in their joy and their sorrow. And the question is, can we extend the circle of people with whom we do that? Sometimes I confess, when I hear on the news about people that I don't know, and it's reported that they've experienced some disaster or some tragedy, or on the other hand, that they have experienced some kind of a wonderful achievement or something that gives them joy, and I think, I don't really care. I don't know them. Doesn't make any difference to me. To practice sympathy, can we extend the boundaries of our circles of caring and be sympathetic? Number 3, finally, all of you, be lovers of your fellow believers. Now, this is something that Peter learned from Jesus, because, as you know, Jesus said to his disciples, I give you a new commandment, love each other just as I have loved you. So you also must love each other. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, when you love each other. But Peter also knew that it's not just our fellow Christians, those who agree with us, those who are in our own circles that we must love. Because Peter knew that Jesus had also said to his disciples, you have heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you so that you will be acting as children of your Father who is in heaven. And when I read about those who harass you, I think again about the people to whom Peter was writing. Those strangers and exiles who were being harassed by the people around them. Love your fellow believers and also your enemies. Number 4, all of you be compassionate. Or another translation would be tender-hearted. Many people have been observing that the tendency in our society, and especially with recent political trends here and elsewhere, is a diminishment of compassion. Jesus was described as compassionate. He was the gentle shepherd of whom we just sang. So when he saw the crowds and saw how lost and needy they were, Jesus is said to have had compassion for them. When he met individuals who needed healing, individuals who needed support and friendship and acceptance, Jesus had compassion for them. And he taught his disciples to practice compassion. In the parables, think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, who picked up a man who had been beaten and left by the side of the road, and the Samaritan came along and gave him a drink and gave him medicine and cleaned his wounds and put him on his donkey, not having a mountain bike to transport him on, put him on his donkey and took him to the inn and paid for his lodging there. What does it mean for us? What would it mean to have an attitude and to practice actions of compassion? What would it mean for us to do that within our families? And sometimes it's hard to be compassionate for our family members. What about being compassionate to our fellow church members? But also, we are called to be compassionate to the homeless, to refugees like the people to whom Peter wrote, to be compassionate to those who are hungry, to be compassionate to other racial groups, and so on. All of those people who need Christ's compassion and ours. Number 5, finally, be modest in your opinion of yourselves. Again, we notice a parallel in Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul wrote, I can say to each one of you, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Well, we do know people, and perhaps cats, who look into a mirror and what they see there is something far more honorable, far more important, far more powerful, far more superior in every way than they really are. In the passage that was read for us in 1 Peter 3:15, we're told, whenever whenever anyone asks you to speak of your hope, be ready to defend it. It does not say, be ready to defend all of your opinions about everything. No. When you're called upon to defend and explain your faith, your hope, your confidence in God, your relationship with God and with God's people, be ready to talk about that and explain it. But, he says, with this qualification, do it with respectful humility, maintaining a good conscience. Well, this is the first 5. There's a 6th point. So far, we've been talking about things that we should be. It says, be all of these things. And now there's a point about doing. The 6th one is, don't pay back evil for evil or insult for insult. Instead, give a blessing in return. I was reading in preparation for this sermon what various other people have said about this passage. And I came across a statement by Scott McKnight, who wrote a commentary on this. Scott McKnight said, it's difficult to imagine Peter thinking of Christians throwing hostile barbs at one another. And I thought, really? Scott McKnight, what kind of a church do you go to? Because I have seen lots of Christians throwing hostile barbs at one another, and I suspect you have too. The current issue of Canadian Mennonite has several stories about people in churches, in our churches, doing wrong to fellow members. The subtitle of this issue is Rescuing the Faithful When the Church Throws Them Overboard. And as the magazine illustrates, it happens between individuals, it happens within congregations. Canadian Mennonite includes a story about Mennonite Church Canada, and it has an update on the recent outcry that you've perhaps heard about from some MCC workers about their experiences that were very unpleasant. If you have access to it, I especially recommend that you read Betty Priest's article with the title, 3 Responses to the Conundrum of Conflict. That's very helpful. Oh yes, Scott McKnight, Christians do throw hostile barbs at one another. But Peter wrote, don't pay back evil for evil, insult for insult. Instead, give a blessing in return. And once again, he was passing on something that he had learned from Jesus, who said, you've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. If someone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. There are debates going on, as you know, amongst Christians about whether non-retaliation should apply in the political realm. And on this morning's news, there are stories of what's happening in Syria, where people are being killed in retaliation for wrongs that were done previously. And we can look around the whole world and see this is what happens when somebody injures somebody else and there's retaliation. But we're not going to pursue all of those political questions now. But we can talk about an important model from our own faith history. This year we are marking the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism. And one of the heroes of that story is a guy by the name of Dirk Wilms. Perhaps you've seen this very famous picture. In 1569, Dirk Wilms was being chased by what is called a thief catcher. And he ran across a frozen canal to try to escape, and he made it across, but his pursuer fell through the ice. And Wilms turned back to rescue his pursuer. Instead of retaliating, he blessed his pursuer. And because he stopped running, he was captured by the very man whose life he saved and was subsequently burned at the stake. He demonstrated what Peter wrote: it's better to suffer for doing good than for doing wrong. I do, however, want to offer this caveat. This does not mean that people should remain in abusive situations, whether in our homes, whether at work, whether in our country, wherever we might experience that. Peter says we shouldn't retaliate in the same form, but sometimes it's necessary and important to get away from sources of harm. Just as Dirk Willems was trying to escape from the man who was intending to arrest him. And this is what Peter had also learned from Jesus in his experience when he was traveling with Jesus and the other disciples, and they were going through a village in Samaria, and they wanted to spend the night there. But the villagers refused to welcome him, and when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to consume them?" But Jesus spoke sternly to them, and they went on to another village. They went on to some place where they would be welcomed and safe. So these are the 6 things that Peter says God's people should do, the ways in which we should live. It isn't always easy. There are some situations that are very tough to live like this. And there are some personalities that are really, really challenging. So why would we make the effort? Peter says we do it because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. And then he continues with a quotation from Psalm 34. Those who want to love life and see good days should shun evil and do good. Seek peace and chase after it. The Lord's eyes are on the righteous. His ears are open to their prayers. If we practice these attitudes and these actions, God will notice our efforts and hear our prayers for guidance and wisdom and strength to do the right thing. And we will inherit a blessing, and others will be blessed as well. In a recent Bible study on this passage, somebody asked, but how do we build an inner life that helps us to respond in these ways? And I'd like to expand the question and say not only how do we individually build such an inner life, but because we're talking about the church's identity and what God has called the church to be corporately, let's ask, how do we build a corporate life that helps us respond in these ways? There are many things that we can do. I will only start by suggesting this, that we have frequently to look in the mirror and see ourselves accurately. So I must honestly evaluate my attitudes and actions and ask, am I being of one mind, sympathetic, compassionate? Do my actions show that I love people? Am I modest in my opinion of myself? When people do evil or speak evil against me, do I try to get even? Or do I respond to their actions with a blessing? And in the churchly community, we also have to honestly evaluate our corporate practices, our attitudes and actions? Are we being of one mind, sympathetic, compassionate? Do our actions show that we love people? Are we modest in our opinion of ourselves? When people do evil or speak evil against us, do we try to get even? Or do we respond to their actions with a blessing? It is a tough challenge that Peter left his people with and that Peter leaves us with. But thank God we don't have to do it alone. This letter ends with a blessing and a promise. It's addressed to you, which is both singular and plural. To you individually and to you corporately. Peter says, the God of all grace, the one who called you into his eternal glory in Christ Jesus, will himself restore, empower, strengthen, and establish you. This is my prayer for you. May it be so. Amen.